Writing is important to any discipline in the university. It's a very central part of research in most disciplines, and definitely central to presenting your research, publishing your research. We've got in mind the writing program that invited 3 speakers from diverse disciplines across the campus. The first one is Xavier Bolzar from Physics and Astronomy, and then Kate Gulick from Communication Studies, and thirdly, Carol Hopstotsky from History. So our first speaker, Xavier Bolzar, research interests are mainly in studies of materials properties by diffraction methods. The focus is on strain and defect determination through the measurement and modeling of diffraction line broadening and development of methods for analysis of residual strain, stress, texture, and defects in materials. Materials currently of interest include ferroelectrics, wide band gap semiconductors, and nanocomposites for biomedical.
Thank you. Hey guys, I bet you understood every word actually that you heard now, right? So that's kind of a good start. You can fall asleep right away, right? Well, first of all, how are we doing? It's already 6 p.m. and you are still here. That's good, that's good. This writing program is actually working you hard, but that's great. What else to do on Tuesday evening? Come on. So, what I wanted to tell you a little bit about my research and what kind of writing I do. So, we started with a physicist, right? So that's already scary enough. Maybe I should stop here. But I would actually like to tell you a little bit about things that we do in a broader context. So, first of all, I usually start actually all of my lectures with a quote. So this is considering this molecule here that I have in my hand, and I already heard one of you actually that knew what this molecule was. I can bet there's another person that will be able to tell as well. This is my former student for FSM class. I can see another student from physics preparatory class. So you guys are not entitled, okay, to say anything. So what is this? No, you're excluded, sorry. You'll get extra credit, but don't speak up now. All right, so first of all, it reminds me of a soccer ball, okay? Does it you? Yeah, that's right. You have the same actually system like a soccer ball. You can just, try to pass it around, okay? So everybody has a chance to see it.
Pretty cool.
And it is an actual molecule, and it is called fullerene. And it was named after Buckminster Fuller. And actually it doesn't have anything to do with Buckminster Fuller. Okay, it was discovered by another group at Rice University by Smalley, Professor Smalley, his collaborators. But he actually named it after Buckminster Fuller for this reason. Who said, when I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty. I only think about how to solve the problem. But when I have finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong. All right? So this is this connection of nature or sciences that study nature, right? And maybe other things like arts and humanities, whatever you guys like. So maybe you'll tell me, well, actually, it doesn't look beautiful to me, but to us, actually, it does. Now, who was Buckminster Fuller? Anybody knows that?
He designed big geodesic domes, among other things.
There you go, something like this. And you can still find, actually, some of those domes, especially at some of the airports across the U.S. So this was the idea of Professor Smalley after they discovered this molecule, actually, to name it after Buckminster Fuller. They could have named it after whoever invented soccer, right? So what is my research about? I study condensed matter. Condensed matter is just the regular stuff around us, like this table or this wood here. It's probably not real wood, but anyways, it's some kind of material. So what I do actually, I look at the properties of this stuff. Now, this is called condensed matter physics or nanophysics, nanoscience. This is one of the buzzwords that you may have heard even on news. And Nature, which is one of the two top scientific journals, another one being Science, did a study only, 6 years ago, and it concluded that the hottest 5 topics in physics will all be condensed matter field. And some of these are actually materials you may have heard of. So quantum dots, for instance, fluorescence now we mentioned right now. So it is obviously very, very, as we say, hot research area. And maybe that's the reason that over half of the physicists overall study condensed matter physics. Our colleagues that are in other research area of physics that tell us usually, oh, it's not the reason because this is hot topics, but you guys have just done. So you have to have quite a few condensed matter physicists actually to understand this problem. I don't know what's true. So what is it? Properties of material of condensed state, right? So we are just studying actual materials and their properties when they are not gases. So condensed matter means either solid like this or fluids, for instance, like water or something else. And encompasses all of the things around us. So you can find some of the condensed matter physics that study electronic materials, that study some of the biomaterials that are used in medicine, and so on. Now, that tells you that the condensed matter physics is just interdisciplinary. And everything that you do almost these days in sciences or engineering is interdisciplinary. You can appreciate, for instance, if you grab your cell phones, so look at your computers, right, that contain quite a few components. Most of these actually were invented by physicists, but later developed and perfected by engineers, by chemists, by mathematicians, and so on. So, some of the crystal structures actually that are of interest to me. Some of you may recognize, now we described already this one. Anybody knows this crystal structure? They're getting all the extra credit today.
Nanotube?
Nanotube, that's right. These are some of the ferroelectric materials, like barium titanate. This is some of the high TC superconducting material that conduct electricity without any resistance. And this is very large molecule, and we have it in all the bodies. Protein, one of the protein molecules. So, how do I study these properties? First of all, any kind of research, as you know, you start in the library, right? And it doesn't have to be physical library. You can go online and actually research what was done previously on that particular subject. After you're done with this first part, you decide whether you should proceed with your research or not. And if you do, then for me, and I'm an experimental physicist, I have to do some measurements. So collect relevant data. For instance, this is laboratory instrument that I have here across the street in the physics department. Or this is some measurement that we do at the big user facilities. This is, for instance, Advanced Photon Source that is located close to Chicago, Illinois. All right? This is one of my students actually who accompanied me to doing these measurements. She's quite shy, so I actually cannot see her face. All right, so measurements at the synchrotron, for instance, that we did. We are going to collect some data that look like this. Okay, right now, I just want to show you actually what we do, right? You're not going to understand the details, but it will give you some kind of illustration, actually, what research is about. So this is some image that you have to analyze. Now, we analyze those measurements, and depending on how many you have, you may spend actually months of doing this, and then I wouldn't be a real physicist if I wouldn't scare you with an ugly formula there, right? So you, for instance, put things into formulas like this and try to calculate actually what the end result is going to be. Now, The most important step is actually if you find the results that are of interest to scientific community, you have to publish them. And this is the writing part of my research, okay? And we have this saying, publish or perish. And this is very much true. You probably know that most of your professors have to publish something in order to stay here working at university, right? To give you a hard time. So there's this another component. One is teaching, another one is doing research and publishing results of your research. Now, my research and all the research that is done in natural sciences may be a little bit different from, for instance, if you are writing novels, right? So what is important actually for publishing material in scientific journals like Nature that I mentioned? If you are researching in natural sciences, you have to actually write objectively, right? You measured some data, you analyze them, and then present them in the way that any other researcher actually can repeat those measurements and obtain the same results. Okay, so this is the essence of doing research and publishing in natural sciences. So there is certain form and style actually that is required. The same goes not only for articles in scientific journals, but also for reports and grant proposals. So grant proposals is when you write down something and based on your previous research, right, ask for some funding, okay? And that goes to some funding agency and they then tell you whether, of course, you get funded or not. So this is a very important part as well. There's also presenting your research. Most of us travel to conferences, right, to talk to our colleagues, present results of our research, and exchange ideas. And that is being done by students as well. In our department, for instance, by undergraduate students, too. All right, so just to finish, on this note, so if you were bored actually during these 10 minutes, that's good, right? Because it's considered to be work. So this is how I usually actually at the end of the day, right, conclude whether I had a good day at work or not. I'm just kidding. Research is fun. And I'm sure that you guys know that and enjoy doing it. And I'm sure that you're just freshmen right now, right? But you will actually get involved in research much more in your next 3 years here. So, thank you very much for your attention. We'll answer questions at the end, right? So, after everybody's done.
Our second speaker is Kate Will. Kate Will's research explores how social, historical, economic, and political dimensions of cultural communications are re-articulated, subverted, or transformed by performances of cultural memory. Through conversations with community members who lived through various education policy attempts to redress social inequality, her work shows that contemporary communities continue to be fissured by the persistent power of memory and educational policy hamstrung by divergent cultural interpretations. She recently published a book entitled Bring Desegregation Home. Without further ado,
Good evening. I guess I should start by saying I am a huge fan of the writing program at BU. I think that the classes that you have this year, even though they're required, and if you're anything like my son's, writing may not be your passion, are critical to your life, not just at BU, but actually once you get out of the university. One of the things I think you can get out of a BA is to be a good writer. In other words, to be able to think well and paper. And basically at BU, you have your first year and you have your advanced seminar to be able to do that. And I have found, being an FSEM teacher, that a lot of my FSEM students who come in good writers are good writers their first year, and when I see them at my ASIM, they haven't necessarily improved. So I guess what I would say is I hope that you take what you learned this year and actually try to cultivate your own capacity as writer for your 4 years here, because I think it's one of the most valuable life skills, and I don't even teach writing per se. My area of research looks at public education and cultural memory. And what I argue in my research is that public education is a key civil rights issue of our time. It is the issue that connects issues of culture, the economy, social issues, and educational issues. And I think if you really think about it, actually that sounds less, given the whole waiting for Superman craze, issues of charter schools, changes in schools, high stakes testing, No Child Left Behind is probably something that you all are very familiar with. But if you think about it, we all have to be in school at least K through 12. And most states, at least half of their budget is spent on public education. And as many of you know, in a lot of the major metropolitan areas, maybe around 50% of students are graduating from high school. So what I'm interested in thinking about is how do we understand the history of our attempts to deal with race, education, and social inequality, and how that influences those cultural memories of that experience, specifically after Brown versus Board of Education, and when did Brown versus Board of Education happen? Any guess? 1954. Good, you were close, within 2 years. But basically, post-Brown, which is our first national attempt to say, we need to think about integration, we need to think about education and equality. What are the stories that people tell? And specifically, I'm interested in the lived experience. So in 1954, as most of you didn't know, the Supreme Court said that separate but equal is no longer equal. But in fact, I was doing my research, oral history, ethnographic research in North Carolina in a small rural county called Camden County, which is near the Outer Banks in North Carolina, for my dissertation and subsequently for articles I wrote and a book that I wrote. And many of the people who lived through that experience didn't find that their lives were touched at all until 1968. So what does it actually mean? And what kind of stories do we tell? So when we think about the kind of questions I ask and what are the interpretive registers or the analytical lenses that I use to make sense of these stories that I hear, basically I look at three things. I look at issues of storytelling, culture, dialogue and power, and cultural memory. So in terms of storytelling, I have a mass of ethnographic oral history interviews. So I went and talked to probably about 30 people, which means that since I did this over about 3 years, I was going and doing in-depth repeat interviews. So for me, since I'm a communication scholar interested in cultural meaning, oftentimes I can't get the answers to the questions I want to know in a 1 hour or a 2 hour visit. So I may be going back to talk to the same person 3 times. You're cultivating a relationship, but then what do? You've got hundreds of pages of transcripts of interview data. How do I make that into a scholarly publication? How do I deal with this published or perished? And how does it turn into a dissertation, and then which is essentially a paper on steroids of anything that you would write? I mean, as a graduate student, I was in that same situation. I'm like, what am I going to write this big paper that I have to write in order to get out of my degree program? And I didn't necessarily have an idea of what I wanted to research at the beginning of my program, even though I've been a student for 15 plus years. And so I actually got invited to an interdisciplinary research project where people wanted to, education and history scholars, so in an interdisciplinary way, people wanted to understand what are the untold stories of Brown versus Board of Education. We have this national narrative, but what can we learn from people who actually lived through this? How did it affect their everyday lives, and how do those memories of times, maybe several decades past, actually continue to influence how future generations orient towards education and think about the role of the public school in the community more broadly. So in terms of the questions I ask or the lenses I use, one is just storytelling. If you think about it, how do we tell the story of education and social inequality and race? Do we tell the story as something that began with Martin Luther King's dream, that ended with school integration and now is over and done with, and anyone who works hard enough can compete in the playing field is basically equal? Do we tell the story of uneven and racially disproportionate results in public education that continue to this day? Or do we tell the story, which a lot of people don't tell, of in fact, even though there was a lot of civil rights advances, which is part of our national history and national story, there was a lot of ways in which in the hearts and minds resisted these changes. And we might talk more about institutional racism or microaggressions today. So there's lots of different ways to tell a similar story, depending on one's own experience of living through that time and depending on who we're talking to. So as a researcher, how do I square stories which may be vastly different? And what is my contribution? Is my contribution simply to interview someone, take their stories, and then put it on paper and put my name on it? What kind of value added as a writer and a scholar can I offer? And so for me, some of that is a deep cultural, social, and historical context, but then specifically to think about, so what? You know, what does it matter that we have these stories? How does this shape the present? So my research is always thinking through the past as a way to understand the contemporary debates around public education that most all of you navigated when your parents decided where you were going to live, where they were going to send you to school. How is that shaped by certain cultural and historical experiences? The second lens that I use besides storytelling is dialogue. So when you think about the stories that we hear about public education, do we focus on particular, when you think about the civil rights movement and struggles for education, who are the figures that you think about? Malcolm X, okay. Who else? What are other kind of key civil rights movement folks? Rosa Parks, exactly. So do we think about, in terms of our conversations that we have, these kind of heroic moments and kind of key figures that we can't imagine being ourselves, or do we think about the everyday people who were part of changing the schools? Like, for example, what happened when schools integrated? One of the things that happened was a lot of the black principals and teachers were let go. So what does it mean to start to include their memories and voices into a conversation about who is connected and invested and feels like they own public schools now, and what kind of history does that come out of? Or if we think about having a contemporary debate about public education, who do we invite to that discussion? And what do we talk about? What do we say? Oh, well, that's in the past, we just want to focus on this year's progress. You know, what do we say is off the table? So thinking about the conversations that we have and who is included, what voices are heard, what topics are considered, and what is forgotten or what's left out. How does that shape our own understanding of kind of the contemporary problems around education? And then the last issue is specifically cultural memory. So how does the past matter in the present? And why does it matter that I go talk to people in rural North Carolina about what happened from 1968 to 1972 in their communities? How does this tie to a larger cultural narrative? So for me, dialogue, cultural memory, and storytelling are all analytical lenses or ways of making sense of and giving a greater significance to some of these individual oral histories that I hear. And so as a researcher, how do I actually know what I'm hearing is true? And does it matter that it's true? From a communication perspective, on one level, whether the story is really true or not actually isn't necessarily what we're looking at, but we're looking at how cultural meaning circulates through communities and creates its own truths that people believe in, that people continue to tell, that generations hear about all, you know, across time, whether or not they actually are kind of a capital T truth that happens. So I spend a lot of time in archives. And I spent a lot of time talking to a range of different people who could help me triangulate what one person told, right? So that I might get, for example, 5 different perspectives, not necessarily all the same, on one particular principle that I was writing a chapter of my book about. And I needed to have both historical context to understand what was really going on at the time, which meant going to the university archives in small towns in rural North Carolina, as much as I needed to have a sense that there was a kind of narrative fidelity or a truth that I could discern from a number of interviews, so that I could consider that to be part of the story I was telling about the cultural memory, the cultural history, kind of the lived experience of this public education policy. Okay, I'm great. Thank you, David. I guess one thing to say is that what that actually meant in terms of writing looked a number of different ways. So on the one hand, I wanted to get my friggin' dissertation done, like you wanted to get a paper done. And the audience for that dissertation was really a committee of 5 faculty members. In some ways, maybe no one else ever read it. And in some ways, I just needed them all to read it, say that it was good, check off, and kind of be able to move on. At the same time, as soon as I got done with my PhD, what I was told by my publisher is, we're really interested in your topic, but your book cannot be your dissertation. And I'm like, what do you mean it can't be my dissertation? You want a book on the oral history of school desegregation in North Carolina, looking at cultural memory, and I already interviewed 30-some people and spent time in archives. If it's not a dissertation, then what does it need to be? Because I've already dedicated 3 years of my life and countless hours of revision to creating this. And basically what it said is, it's a different audience, right? So we want you to both be able to talk to scholars and to someone, for example, for me as an oral historian, I wanted the people I interviewed to be able to pick up the chapter I wrote about them and for it to make sense and be accessible. So how do I write a book where someone who may not have gone past 6th grade and is 80 years old can pick it up and recognize themselves and feel like I am doing an honor to them as a subject in my interviewees. And at the same time, in my publisher Paris world, have my colleagues read it and say, oh, this is, a great theoretical contribution, and we see that this is real scholarship, not just storytelling. And so basically what I ended up doing was doing more research, interviewing more people, so enhancing the content, but mostly just changing the form. So what I did, instead of having these kind of interwoven, theoretical, analytical, oral history chapters for each one, I divided the book into 6 narrative chapters. So for any one of those narrative chapters, each which addressed basically one person's oral history, I felt like they could pick it up. And while they might not get every nuance and they might not care what cultural capital was, by and large, they could read it and say, okay, I can judge this and think about, is this doing justice in this kind of narrative storytelling? So I had to become a nonfiction storyteller, even though no one ever really trained me to do that. And then I needed to speak to my academic audience. So I had 3 bridge chapters which were theoretical. And that's where I really kind of wrote an extremely different register. And my goal was, scholars could pick it up and read the 3 chapters, and if they wanted to, also read the narrative chapters to get a deeper understanding. But my interviewees could pick it up and read the 6 narrative chapters and understand those and skip over the theoretical. So that's just to say that's one example of how, even for exactly the same material, in terms of thinking about your audience and really who you're writing for, it can radically change how you write and how you present that material. And then I could bore you to tears by talking about how I translated that into my own discipline, where really all they care is how is what I'm saying speaking to esoteric disciplinary debates. And I know that for the most part, mostly no more than 20 people will read those articles unless they've are so unlucky to have them assigned in their classes as undergraduates, right? So I realized that for that, I'm performing a whole different sense of proficiency, and in fact, being a different writer. And so one of the things I would say is that as you're here, one of the things the writing program right now focuses on, and I think it's invaluable, is to think about how you can present your passions and your intellectual contributions, or the things you really want to advocate about, to various audiences, and how that then changes the way in which you write, and in some really fun ways, the voices that you use.
Our next speaker, Carol Helstowski's research has looked at the ways in which food consumption became a politically charged issue in modern European history. In 2004, she published a book, Garlic and Oil, Food and Politics in Modern Italy, which examined this issue in the context of liberal, fascist, and democratic regimes in Italy. She's currently writing a history of pizza that charts pizza's meteoric rise in popularity around the world. Beyond food, but still focusing on Italy, she's currently examining several celebrated cases of Italian art forgery, as well as the nature of the Italian art market, in order to determine how and why Italians gained a reputation for being deceptive in the early 19th and 20th century.
Thanks. Maybe you figured out I am referred to as the pizza lady. The pizza book came out, and I'll talk a little bit about the different contexts that I've written work in Italian cultural history. But first, just to kind of echo what I think Kay said about the importance of learning writing, it's also really important to learn how to do really good research. One of my jobs here at DU is to teach in the history department something called senior seminar. We have a requirement that every single one of our majors do original research and write an article-length study. So not just honor students, but everyone. And I've taught the research part of that class now for several years. And I can say that a few years, while students are doing it, they're not very happy about it. There's a lot of frustration. They want research to be super easy. They want an argument to fall in their laps. They want it to be done and over so they could move on with their lives. But I get 2, 3, 4, even 5 years out, emails still from my graduating seniors who say, at the time I gave you a really hard time about having to write this required thesis, but now I'm a lawyer and I can't tell you how much this independent research project helped me get into law school and how much it prepared me. Or now I research technology use in healthcare, and I can't tell you how much those basic techniques really aided me in my job. So I just want to say that when you get an assignment, whether it's in a writing class or whatever kind of class or history class, take advantage of that. Go crazy. Be creative. Do as much research as you possibly can, because you never know where it's going to come in handy later. But to get back to what I do, I've published, my dissertation became Garlic and Oil, which was a book about the politics of food in Italy. Subsequently, I also published a book that was about food culture in the Mediterranean. So that was a multi-country study that had a very different audience. It was intended for undergraduate and graduate students in the field of food studies. And I also published this book, Pizza, which was great fun to write, which I was told the basic format of the book, what it would be and how long it would be. So it wasn't necessarily my own original research project, but something I was asked to do. And that was intended for a popular audience. I have also published articles on my work now, which is on the art market and art forgery, which is for my own edification and for dialogue with other people in European, Italian history, art history, visual studies, so on and so forth. And I am editing, so controlling the writing of others, editing a book about global food studies, in which we're really trying to sort of turn some basic assumptions about the consumption of food on their heads through unusual case studies. So I'm deeply involved, I think you can tell us, in what we like to call cultural history. and I studied this vis-a-vis Italy. Bless you. My field and where I sort of gravitate to is the 19th century, the 1800s, and the early 20th century, the early 1900s, which for Italy is a bit of a problem if you're a historian. I don't know what you know about Italy or Italian history, but Italy was a largely illiterate culture, an illiterate society. Okay, unlike other countries and nations which may, people will leave diaries behind or laws of official records or what have you. Up until about the 1920s, under fascist educational reform, the majority of Italians didn't even finish school and didn't learn how to read or write. That poses a certain problem for a historian, right? Because I don't have, unlike King, an archive of places that I can go to. Also, because I'm interested in culture, I look at what might be considered sort of odd things to tell me about Italian history, like food, like art. My interest in these things and what guides me in my research and in problematizing my research isn't so much the food itself, okay? So when I'm asked to write a book about the history of pizza, or I started my first book project on the history of food in Italy, I wasn't interested about the foods themselves and what happened to them throughout history. I was interested in what people did with food, okay, and what food meant to them, and how they created meaning out of food, okay. So that was something that really motivated me. It also motivates me with my work in art and art forgery. I'm interested in what art means to different people. Take the example of forgery. For an unsuspecting tourist or museum collector, circa 1890 in Italy, they may want an authentic piece of Italian history. They may want a valuable antiquity. It has certain meaning to them. The Italian antiquarian or seller or artist may think, geez, they want a piece of Italian history. We have a long tradition of copying and reproduction. Let's give them that. This is a piece of Italian history. It is nonetheless not authentic, okay? And fights break out, debates break out among Italians about what art means and who cheated who. So I'm sort of interested in this question of what culture means to people. Question for me, and the larger problematic, is how do you get at that story? How do you do research in something like that? All right, think about pizza. I'm asked to write this history of pizza. Where would you go? What would you look at in putting together a history of pizza? Any ideas? Discarded pizza boxes? What? Where on earth would you go to write a history of pizza? And then what? What would I do there? I agree, right? There's a rumor that pizza came from Italy, but what? Where would I go? Where would I look?
Bakeries?
Pizza bakeries. What would they tell me about the history of pizza? Would I interview people there? I could. Okay, so they would tell me their own personal history going back for however long they were employed there. Where else would I look? What else might I do? Any ideas? Are you beginning to catch how hard this is? Okay. As a cultural historian, I have to look everywhere. Okay. I look in cookbooks. I look in newspaper articles. I look in periodicals. I look in women's domestic literature. I look anywhere and everywhere. I look at government reports. I look at publications of nutritionists and scientists. I look anywhere and everywhere I can for even a little scrap of information about pizza or Italian food or art or whatever. Okay. And what I find is no one in writing all this material is going to be explicit about the research question that I have. Let me give you an example. When I wrote my dissertation, my big question was, gosh, Italy has a very peculiar economy. People went from not starving in the streets anymore in the 20th century, let's say 1910, 1920, to being okay, what we call a post-subsistence economy. They weren't starving, but they didn't have all that they wanted to eat either. We're not talking about a heavily consumerist economy where folks can eat as much as they want of whatever they want. Okay? I wanted to understand what food meant in that interim period between famine and starvation and having too much food. Okay? Nowhere in any of my records did I find anyone leaving behind an article or a notation that said, I am now living in a post-subsistence economy and this is how it feels. Okay, no one tells me that. I had to go look and piece together my own story. Let me give you an example. 1930s, anyone ever heard of the Futurist art movement in Italy? The Futurists were this avant-garde, crazy group of guys and some women who in the 1930s had a campaign against pasta. They wanted to abolish pasta from the Italian diet. They wanted Italians to threaten the program, stop eating pasta, and move forward into the future. Their prescription was let them eat vitamin pills or some sort of futuristic food or whatever, but stop eating pasta. Okay? That was interesting to me. I didn't know what to do with it, but I put it somewhere. I took notes. Observed it. Turned to a cookbook from the same time period. I find this woman, I look at the chapters in the cookbook. There is a section on cod. There are at least 40 different ways to prepare cod, all harkening back to Italian traditions. That seems interesting. Okay, she's clearly obsessed with cod. She's writing a lot of recipes about cod. They talk about Italy's past. This may be needed. Take a note of it. Always take careful notes and figure out what you're writing about. Keep it somewhere. Don't ever discard anything. That's my advice for you, okay? By putting these two stories together, right, and other stories like them, I determined that in the 1930s, Italy was at a real moment vis-a-vis food, where people were kind of talking through food about other issues. They were really talking about where was Italy headed. Were they moving forward into the future, or were they trying to draw from their past? And the other question I thought that was very interesting was, why were they using food? What was going on there? What's the story behind that story? So if you catch my drift here, when you start doing research and you come up with an interesting concept and you begin piecing things together, if it's good research, it should lead to more questions rather than answer everything. Okay, if there's one thing I can tell you, you will never be done with research, right? If you're a scholar, you'll never finish. And I don't mean that in the sense that you'll never finish, you'll never publish. Obviously, you have to publish, but you will still be motivated by questions. That's frustrating sometimes for you as a student, right? You want to be done, right? The paper is 5 to 7 pages, I want to be finished, okay? But really good research, you may not use all of it, but you keep going. Another thing that I might advise you to do as you're doing research, this is true in the scientific field, but I think it's also true in communications and in history. As scholars and as students, good research is always about a careful balance of reading the existing literature and finding out what's been done before. And based on that existing literature, try to carve a place for yourself. What can you say that's original and creative? This is something I am always pushing my seniors to do. Right? They want to get going. They want to research the causes of the Civil War, right? Or why Versailles led to the rise of the Nazis. They're chomping at the bit to go and do that. And then I tell them, gosh, the first thing you have to do is historiography. Okay, so in other words, read what 7 or 8 other historians have written on this subject. Big sigh. But it really helps them situate their own work. Okay? So do become familiar, if you're given a research assignment, what is the literature? And ask yourself, have confidence in yourself, what contribution can I make? What is it I can say that hasn't been said before? Right? What can I offer that would be original? And that's handy no matter what you're doing, right? As you apply for grants later or something like that, it helps to be original. In my own research, as I'm looking at these rather peculiar sources, and maybe you'll come across this too, I keep asking myself the central question, what is going on here? What is this all about? Take the example of pizza. One of the places that I looked at were newspaper articles. I was assigned to trace the history of pizza in Italy, trace it when it came to the United States, and then talk about it becoming a global phenomenon. Okay. So I look for newspaper articles, fairly easy online database searching, in the United States, and I find all these really weird recipes for pizza in the 1950s that are thick crusted pizza topped with things like sliced onions and liverwurst. Disgusting, right? Maybe not. I don't know, maybe that sounds tasty to you. I said, what is going on here? What is this? Okay. I kept digging. I kept pulling at these sources. I thought about the context. I read some material on where these sources were coming from, which was mostly the Midwest, and determined what? These newspapers and Italian Americans were trying to sell a peculiarly Italian food to Americans in the Midwest. So they were putting their own little Midwestern spin on pizza in order to sell this stuff. Okay, so keep asking yourself, especially when something unusual or weird pops up, what is the story behind the story? But what's really going on here? And that may lead you back to the what we call secondary sources, literature, what other people have written. It may lead you on to new sources, but keep your minds open. After you figure out what kind of story you want to tell, no matter what the research paper is, ask yourself if you have enough evidence. And keep going back. Good research and good research papers are a very careful balance between sufficient evidence, the secondary literature, what other people have said, right, and further study. In other words, it's never over. Okay? You want to make sure and constantly check yourself to see that you're not misinterpreting things, to see that you're not making too much of a rather small piece of evidence or a rather small source. Okay? Here, I find it very useful. I work in a rather limited community of Italian historians, but in food history, there's lots of people. So I have a lot of folks who I send my writing to and say, what do you think of this? Is this okay? Does this seem right to you? Okay, so rely on others to kind of give you feedback. That includes your professors, but also each other. And return to your writing, because you may need to find other sources. Okay. I think I want to conclude by saying, for the most part, it's slow going, but it's worthwhile. Okay. I get a real charge out of being able to do research in many cases because the area that I work in is highly creative, it's original. It's something that not a lot of people are interested in for this part of the world. It's changing a little bit, but it's really exciting to go to the archive, or it's really exciting when you're staring and staring at a very unusual source and you can't quite figure it out, to suddenly have some realization of what you're doing and say, oh yeah, I can tell a story with this, and I can tell a story that matters. Okay? So I would advise you, no matter how frustrating it is, to stick with it. Thanks.
Hey, sit still, there's a little Q&A coming, I think, okay?
Yeah, we'll now open the floor up for questions, and Sarah and Kate and Phil will answer your questions.
So I'm Cornelia from the Writing Department, and I was facilitating the discussion here. So we'd like questions from any of you, whether about writing or about research, for one, for all of the panelists. Would somebody like to begin? Yeah.
How do you determine what's valuable and what's not? What's called essential?
It may depend on the field, right? But valuable is also relative kind of a term, if you ask me. So maybe what's valuable to you is not to me. Usually in natural sciences we have very good, what we call review articles that give an overview of particular relatively narrow research field. And these are usually experts that write those articles, and you kind of, most of the researchers tend to believe what they say is important or it is not. It can be, of course, misleading, and one part of being and doing original research, right, is for you actually to form your own opinion. So I think that's how you determine what's valuable and what's not.
I think you,
The other thing I'd say is cast a wide net initially. Because one of the problems when you're just starting to explore a problem is that you may not yet know the terrain well enough to make those decisions about what's valuable or not. So for me, something like the archives, I mean, I go once and whatever I take out of that archive, I can use later. Otherwise, I'm traveling back to North Carolina to go find that other document. So to a degree, I always think it's better to be promiscuous early and then later on what I call to my students kill babies. In other words, everything becomes valuable to us, right? We don't want to get rid of our baby, but good writers at some point have to realize that this may be all interesting to me. Everything about pizza may be interesting, even the liverwurst, but it may not have any place in this particular piece of writing, right? So that you have to, for me, I find that I have to have a wide net. And then as I get clear on what my question is or what I've said in the paper, and then think about how I'm going to frame what I've said in rewriting my introduction, then it becomes much clearer of what doesn't make it into this cut of the paper and what stays. So in that sense, what's helping me make compelling arguments that I can also find is substantiated by some contextualization within existing.
I mean, first you have to figure out what's important to you, right? That's what is that, because I think your determination, your passion will speak out, right? If you say, okay, I'm going to write on this, and these are all the things that I think are important. Here's the story that I'm telling, but then there's also an important component where ultimately you have to get feedback, right? Either you from a professor, or in the case of scholars, like you get someone to review your work, and they say, what is this, right? This isn't valuable at all. This isn't what I consider important. Or they back you up, and then you respond back to them. I mean, so it's sort of a two-way street, I think, between you yourself thinking something is valuable and asking others that they also see this as valuable.
And then finally, footnotes and citations. I mean, if you really read a certain body of research, you'll either see that the footnotes are kind of like where they really get into the nitty-gritty, so you can actually see what people are talking about. They'll say, in this extended debate on consumption, blah-bitty-blah, blah-bitty-blah, and they're starting to tell you basically who are the people you should be fluent in when you're talking about that, or who gets cited over and over again. You should probably recognize that at least that community of folks thinks that's valuable, and that you need to be fluent in their argument, even if you choose to take another path.
Sometimes it's very good to stick with your ideas. Many Nobel Prizes are given for research that other people said there's no way it's going to result in anything valuable. So if you really believe in what you're doing, what you're seeing, right, then stick with it.
Okay, great question. Other questions? Yeah.
For those papers, you always have an extended period of time to research as well as bring it all together. As freshmen or undergraduate, putting in a pretty strict timeline. How do you deal with that?
In other words, how do you do good research?
Well, I mean, you given years to do all this research. We're given what, 3 months? I mean, it's like, how do you really prepare to get?
And can I add to that, especially ethnographic research, we require students to interview people, not in the course of 3 years,
Right.
but in the course of 3 days or 3 hours and make an argument out of it.
One thing I would say is do less well. Something I say to my undergrad and grad students all the time. I'm trying to convince them to do less. Because if you can't change the 10 weeks period, and it's pretty demanding for writers. So then you need to narrow your scope and decide you're not going to give the world's treatise on X, Y, and Z, but you might be able to say something significant on something smaller. And so even though you're really interested in X big question, the truth is you can't do that justice in the time that you have with the other demands. So so what you do is you figure out what's one piece of that question that I'm still interested in that I could, given the time that I have to investigate this, say something about. So I often just say, shrink it and focus on doing one thing really well, then doing a handful of things mediocre or superficial treatment.
And it's also organization. figure out what it is, what the project is, what you need to do. When I teach seniors and they've got 10 weeks to write a 25 to 30 page paper based on original research, that takes a lot of organization, right? You've really got to stick with your plan and come back and reassess, in which case you might decide, gosh, I can't explain all the causes of the Civil War, so I'll just look at this one. And then it becomes writer's craft, where you have a really small body of evidence, but you're working it as much as you can, right? And creating something that is truly your own original. But that takes a lot of foresight and thought, and you have to stay organized. That's why this is good research and writing. It's also about project management, I would say.
Figure out how you think. So I use in my undergrads and grads often use concept maps. In other words, like I realize there's 3 things I want to be talking about, and then off of each one of these main ideas there may be these different sub-ideas. But I don't really understand exactly what I want to say yet and how they all fit together. So I may not be starting with a paper outline, because that's not how I think. Some people can kind of do a deductive, here's my argument, here's where it starts, here's my subpoints, here's my evidence, and here it is. For me, when I need to synthesize a fair amount of information in a short time, I need to map it out and literally draw it out and be able to move it around, and then figure out later how I'm going to make those connections, because I don't necessarily know them yet. I'm more of an inductive thinker. So some of that really depends on how you as a thinker think and how you can get farther along in that process. That's
I hope, if I may add, that you're not disheartened with some of the comments that actually we made here. Because, there was this concept of research being endless, right? And that's true, that applies to us as well, because you have to say at some point, well, this is maybe reasonably round material, right? Let's stop here and publish it. Otherwise, you won't do anything the whole life, you'll be just researching. So, in terms of you doing research, perhaps, don't think of it this way, because research is really a big puzzle. And it is up to your advisor here, actually, because you're new in research, right, to give you one small piece. And this will be a very, very important piece, but it will be, of course, something that you can do in a reasonable amount of time and based on your knowledge level in this particular topic, right? So this is why we are here actually to direct you to do your research. Later on, you'll realize actually you have this bigger picture and you'll be able to do it yourself. But at the beginning, you do need guidance.
And one of the great conclusions that you can draw is more research needs to be done.
That's right. All right. There was a question there. Yeah.
When you talked about your research in North Carolina, you talked about interviewing a large number of individuals. Now, how do you go about venting that data to see what is relevant, what's even true? Because I know that a lot of people, especially during interviews, can lie about a lot of things or exaggerate certain details. So how?
So, and especially because I was doing this research about a time and actually in a community where still the majority of the memory, I would say, is segregated, right? So that you might, the most, I don't know if the word is powerful, moment where I had competing narratives was around almost lynching. So I was doing one of my in-depth interviews with a kind of local historian of the white community who I had been introduced to as one who's kind of the keeper of Camden County's history, parenthetically, that is the white history. And we're driving down the road and he tells me about this car accident and how his cousin was killed and there was almost a lynching. Then I hear from another person, from an African American person about the same narrative and in a very different context, right? So, that, and at the same time, there's also this issue of ethics, of, I don't disclose that I've heard this before, right? So how do you make sense of these kind of different narratives? I just say in that case, for example, it's the same factual story. What I'm really looking at is the cultural interpretation, right? And so that's where I was trying to get at. I wasn't writing the history of Camden County. I was writing about what cultural memories are alive and continue to be told, and what does that telling, how does that shape the way we interpret the present? So, but the other thing is, anytime that I could, I go to the archives, and that might be school board minutes, it might be microfiche, it might be an article in the paper, it might be that kind of needle in the haystack oftentimes, but what else can I find? I bring it up in subsequent interviews. Not necessarily, here's a story I heard, what do you think, but trying to kind of see who else knows. Like there was this huge interracial basketball game that was impromptu. Well, what are the multiple tellings of that story? And does it really matter that there was one truth? Like, does it matter that it was 52-49? Or could it have been 51-48? And essentially, the meaning and significance it has over time is still important, whether or not that kind of, some of those truths around the actual score really matter so much. But it is, and I guess for me, it's about meaning, as cultural meaning, more than it is about kind of truth. One of my favorite books is called The Truth About Stories by a guy named Thomas Keene, who's an indigenous writer. And one of his main arguments is that what really matters is the meaning that we give these stories, not necessarily some kind of capital T truth.
Are there some other questions?
The one thing I forgot to mention for you is that I would say the sooner everyone gives up the foundational fantasy that they write well under pressure, the better you will be at getting your papers done well in 10 weeks, right? I mean, we have all believed it at some point, right? And really revision is 90% of good writing. So given your time frame, the sooner you start and the less you depend on that last minute inspiration, generally, the better writing you'll be able to turn in.
More questions? We still have time if anybody has questions. All right, well, I'd like to thank all of our speakers.